I think without gratitude, you end up focusing only on the negative. You end up focusing only on places where your life is lacking.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City. Happy Thanksgiving. One of the friendships I'm particularly grateful for is with Father Jim Martin, a prophetic voice within the Catholic Church. Jim's also a New York Times best-selling author, editor-at-large of America magazine, and a consultant to the Vatican. On this week's show, we'll get into his new book, the Global Church Synod he attended in Rome, and the importance of giving thanks, particularly when times are hard. We're growing the State of Belief, building on our 17-year history by partnering with Religion News Service. And as part of the RNS family of podcasts, there's a next generation The State of Belief podcast I want to make sure you are subscribed to. So please visit stateofbelief.com/new podcast. It would really help to have you subscribe and to tell the people you're close to about the conversations you are hearing. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how you can keep this show on the air is available at stateofbelief.com. And you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my guest. Father James Martin is a New York Times best-selling author, editor-at-large at America magazine, and was appointed to the Catholic Church Secretariat of Communication by Pope Francis himself. Father Jim has just gotten back from Rome, where he attended the Church Synod, and he's got a new book out titled Come Forth, The Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle. With all that you've got going on, Jim, I am grateful that you found time to join us for this Thanksgiving episode of The State of Belief. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, my longtime friend. I never say old friend anymore because I got into trouble.
Good.
I think
that's exactly right.
How long have we known each other? Is it like 20 years or?
I would say 20 years now. And you're just getting younger. But you, you, however, have just done so much good work in that time. I'm just so appreciative that you are my friend. And I wanted to congratulate you on this new book. I mean, there's lots we're going to talk about, but I want to dive into this new book. It's called Come Forth, the Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle. For those of us, the many who are listeners who may not be Christian or may not know what you think is Jesus' greatest miracle, can you give us, is it a spoiler to tell us what it is?
Well, I say in the book, it's kind of unintentionally funny, as if there's this kind of competition, between miracles, who's the best.
Right.
Yeah. So actually the cover kind of gives it away. It's the raising of Lazarus, which is a story that appears, as you know, obviously in the Gospel of John. And it is Jesus is raising his friend Lazarus from the dead. He raises two other people in the Gospels, but this is really the one that a lot of people focus on in terms of, him bringing someone back to life. So it is the raising of Lazarus. That's not too much of a spoiler alert, I hope.
No, it's not a spoiler, but it is actually, it's one of the great stories in the Gospel, not just because it's like, Shazam, now you're alive, but because there's such a major, there's so much surrounding story. And because in some ways it's one of the best passages, I'll say, as a preacher in my other, wearing that hat, it's one of the best stories you can preach from. It really is one of the great stories. And I want to get into it, but it's also it's a story that has a narrative, but it also just provides this incredible narrative about every person in a way. So talk to me about, first of all, why this book? What was the thing that was nagging at you? You were like, this is my next book.
Yeah, well, as you say, it's such a great story. And it's a story I believe. I need to say that right out of the gate. When I was young, I saw this may even be before your time, the Franco Zeffirelli miniseries, Jesus of Nazareth, which was on in 1977. And the story, the sort of scene of the raising of Lazarus just blew me away. It was much more dramatic than the scene of Jesus's resurrection, which was kind of off camera. And that really stuck with me. You know, who is this guy that Jesus raises from the dead? Who are these two sisters? Jesus's sisters, for those who don't know, Martha and Mary, are very blunt with Jesus. You should have been here, blah, blah, blah. And then about 10 years ago, I visited the actual place where people believe that it took place. It's actually in Palestinian territory, a town called Al-Azariah, which means the place of Lazarus, believe it or not, current day Bethany. And I went into the tomb, and I just found it a really powerful experience of thinking about what I want to leave behind in the tomb. That's kind of the theme of the book. You know, what are the things that we're called to leave behind, called to let die and move out into new life? And then I started leading pilgrimages to this site. And I found that people were really moved by this encounter, the place, and with the story. And I thought, okay, it's time for me to write something about it. It really has always been. There are more or less there are two or three other stories that I like, but this is kind of the top three gospel stories. So I thought, you know, time to write about it. And I spent about 5 years on it, and a lot of COVID time, not that I had COVID, but during the pandemic. And so it was really great to kind of, you know, dive deep into the story.
Well, it's also, you know, the pandemic seems like an amazing time to do it, given that, you know, death surrounded so many of us, and people were grappling with that. Talk a little bit. I mean, there, you know, Lazarus and Jesus, but Martha and Mary are really interesting stories. And by the way, I'll say, many of you out there I know are not Christians or like, you know, but this is there's some interesting characters in this story. This reads like a great saga. And so, you know, talk a little bit about Martha and Mary, because I identify them. It's like, hey, show up on time, God. Show up on time. You know, like, where were you? And so talk a little bit about, and also the difference between them, because they're often pitted against each other as like, who's the right way to do the thing.
Yeah, you know, I wish I had talked to you before the book. Show Up on Time, God that would be a great chapter title. That's a great book title. Yeah. So for those who don't know, Martha and Mary are friends of Jesus's. They live in Bethany, which is outside Jerusalem. In Luke's gospel, Jesus goes to their house to hang out. And in one of the most I'd say, human scenes, Martha complains that Mary isn't doing enough work, and complains to Jesus and said, don't you care, which I love, don't you care that my sister, I'm doing all the work? Tell her to help me. So super blunt. You know, she's seen as the more active one. Martha's the more contemplative. Mary's the more contemplative one, because she's sitting at Jesus's feet, which is what prompts Martha's complaint. And then in the story of Lazarus, one of the things I say in the book is that the personalities are very similar, because Martha is the one who rushes out to see Jesus first while Mary stays at home. So you get the sense of really their personalities. I think, you know, I'd be curious to know what you think about Martha and Mary, but they are pitted against one another. And a lot of times, unfortunately, people use the story to say, oh, because what Jesus says to Martha when she complains is, Martha, Martha, you are worried about so many things. Mary has chosen the better part, i.e., sitting at my feet and listening to me. It's sometimes used as a kind of denigration of the active life, which I think is unfortunate. I think what Jesus is saying is, look, there's a time and a place for everything. And, right, you know, time to be active, time to be contemplative. So I really focus a lot on Martha and Mary in the book, and, you know, women's roles in scripture, the need to be honest with God in prayer, and, you know, just people's frustration. But I'm curious, why do you like Martha and Mary?
Well, I it's the same thing. I just think that they're like, they both offer roles, and, you know, I get it. Like, I understand both of them. Like, you know, when I'm running around doing the work and someone's like, yeah, you know what, I think I'm just going to sit here and pray. You're like, oh, well, thank you for that. But then often we can be running around and be really active and not stopping and not like reflecting and like, why am I being active? What am I meant to be doing? What are, you know, and, you know, so I do think that they're both valuable, and especially it's so easy to kind of like, you know, point fingers and say, especially to women and roles that they're supposed to have. And so, you know, I sometimes like, you know, preaching and saying, okay, Jesus, what did you really mean here? I mean, it's kind of like, another one is like, even the dogs, and calling, when, I mean, there's moments where you're like, okay, Jesus, let's break this down. I'm going to wrestle with you for a little bit. But, kind of pulling back the lens, or maybe going deeper into the lens, looking at this story that you wrote this book, Come Forth, The Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle, which is about the story of Lazarus. I think part of the reason this preaches so well is that people often, there's so much suffering and so much loss and a sense, I mean, I don't think we're all under delusion that all of a sudden, like, the people we love who have died are going to be risen. But
Right.
like, what can we, what can we learn from this story that can help us live a life well, even when we have lost people? What are some lessons that, as you spent time with the text, what did you come away with?
Well, I think a couple things. I think for the Christian, I know not everybody's Christian, but for the Christian, the idea is that Jesus entered into this world where grief and loss and death and illness are a part of his life, right? And so it's not, for Christians, it's not like we have a God who doesn't understand us, right? I mean, Jesus sort of understands this. He weeps at the tomb, whether out of frustration or anger or sadness. I talk about that in the book. He accompanies the sisters. They're blunt with him. So it's an invitation to be blunt and honest with God in prayer. But I think, for everybody, all believers, I think that the real message of the story, beyond, Jesus having power over death, is that God invites us into new life every moment of our lives. And we are, metaphorically and by analogy, called to leave behind in our tombs whatever keeps us bound, right? I mean, what are the patterns or behaviors or even addictions that really prevent me from living life fully and from moving out into the light? So that's for me kind of the spiritual message of the book. Can you hear God saying to you, come forth, leave behind your grave clothes and all that and come out of the tomb? So right. So that for me is the fundamental message of the story and the book.
Yeah. Yeah, it is it's a wonderful story. And like, one of the things I just want to say, like, you are such a good illuminator of the text. I think it's actually the gift that you have given to the Catholic Christian world, is you go in and you like take these stories and just bring forth these great ideas for living, but also make it accessible. Like, this is available to us for those who are in the Christian tradition and who are interested in Jesus. You had that great book on Jesus. I like to call it as a smart book on Jesus. And then also about, what was the book about laughter in the Bible, which I love.
Yeah. I had to think about it. Between Heaven and Mirth.
That was such a good title.
It's funny, Paul. I mean, one of the things I really do like to do is I like, like yourself, I like good Bible commentaries. I have a couple, about 1 million behind me. And I think, as when you read Bible commentaries, you think, my gosh, why didn't I know this before? And There's so many riches in here. And yet I think to try to sort of, I guess what I'm saying is, I think a lot of the Bible commentaries are already accessible. They're just not as well known. And so I try to do is bring these out to the general reader to say, look, you can kind of get these riches from biblical scholarship and from New Testament scholars that really help illuminate the story. And I love to make these things more well known because, as I said, I think they're pretty accessible. Like, if you're a halfway intelligent person and you open up a Bible comment, you can understand what they're talking about. Yeah. You made it a little bit of catch up, but they're not as well known. And so what I'm trying to do is make some of the scholarship a little bit more well known, kind of in the general readership.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was just at American Academy of Religion, which is
sure.
in San Antonio, and I ran a workshop about making scholarship accessible. And you're a perfect example of that. And so that's marvelous. You also hold a very particular location within the Catholic Church. I mean, you just were at the Church Synod, and I know that some of that is behind closed doors, and you can't be blabbing to me. But what did you walk away with? Those of us who like read about it in the news and see it on social media or see it on TV, we're kind of like, okay, so what's going on over there? Yeah, can you illuminate, first of all, what is the Synod, how often it happens, who gets invited, and what's the point?
Yeah, so the synod is, I mean, as you know, an ancient form of church governance and meeting. It was the earliest one was probably the Council of Jerusalem back in the Acts of the Apostle. For anybody who says like, oh, this is brand new. And then, pretty much all the early church councils were synods, mainly bishops and all sorts of people. In the Second Vatican Council, after the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI decided that there needed to be more kind of a consultative body to help the Pope. And then just recently, Pope Francis appointed what they called, I thought this was a great name. They were really calling us this, non-bishops. Non-bishops, so that's laymen.
Did you have hi, my name is Father Martin, non-bishop. I mean that would have been like, hello, my name is tags.
Well, everybody did have these tags, and it would say like excellency, eminence, so you could tell who was a bishop and who wasn't. But so Pope Francis called this meeting in 2021, and basically it's to look at how the church governs itself. And so it was pretty dramatic and pretty revolutionary, which is why there was so much pushback. And probably the most important message from the synod is the image of all of us in this great conference hall sitting around round tables discussing things, more or less, I mean, as equals. At your table would be cardinals, archbishops, bishops, as well as people like me, lay people, lay theologians, women. I mean, it was pretty exciting. And we were only at part one. Part two is coming next year. And then we'll sort of do a report to the Pope. But just the idea that people were discussing things that had been previously really off the table and kind
completely.
of. Yeah. And, we talked about, I can say this, we talked about women deacons. We talked about LGBTQ people. And it was pretty blunt. People were pretty blunt. And you had people who weren't ever heard at a bishop's meeting, women, for example, and they had votes too at the end. So it was exciting. It was a little stressful, because a lot of, as you know, I do a lot of LGBT work. And so there was a lot of like focus on my responding or people coming up to me. And that was a little stressful, but, in the end, really helpful. It was also exhausting because we met for the entire month of October, including on Saturdays, half days, full day of listening. And, people really took it seriously when you're at your table and someone was making a contribution, which was usually written because they want to take it seriously. You're really paying attention. So it was exciting. It was stressful and exhausting, but ultimately very hopeful. I mean, I think this is the way that someone said after this, you can't imagine a synod of bishops going back to not having lay people or not non-bishops as we were called.
Right. About the longevity. It was funny. I saw you post on social media. By the way, if you're not following Father Martin, he is a prolific on social media. In this case, completely not a negative. I mean, it's completely a positive, accessible, offering, really, really smart commentary. He does gospel lessons on I think it's YouTube or Facebook, I think. But so I saw you post like the first week, and I was like, wow, that looks intense.
It was.
And then there was and then you posted the second week. I was like, oh, he's still there. That's weird. I thought it was like a 3-day thing. And then I was like, wait a second, am I seeing old posts? Like I was like the third week and the fourth week. I was just like, oh my God. So, but some of the headlines that came out were pretty dramatic as far as I saw. I mean, I don't know that maybe you can illuminate, but some of what I saw was really addressed directly trans people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so actually that came after the synod, and it was a big surprise. The new head of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is the kind of Vatican watchdog for theology, was posed it's called a dubium, like a doubt, like a question, basically. Well, what should we do in this case? And they came out very strongly in favor of baptizing transgender people, having them serve as godparents, having them serve as witnesses to weddings. Now, some people would say, oh, well, that was happening, in other places already. Actually, no, it wasn't. And in a lot of places, there was a lot of pushback and a lot of restrictions. So that came out in the wake of the synod. But even during the synod, we talked a lot about LGBT stuff. It was pretty, I would say it was pretty contentious. And not people like, beating each other up. But look, I mean, as you know, Paul, there are very different views about LGBTQ people in sub-Saharan Africa, in Eastern Europe, in Latin America. And I think one of the most positive things was I think this was the first time that this was really discussed in a universal church-wide meeting so honestly. And, I had an opportunity to speak with people who, really, I would say, really strongly disagreed with me, and be cordial and to say, hey, this is where I'm coming from, and let me hear where you're coming from. And it's a start. The start is to build friendships. That one of the best, I don't know if you've ever heard this line from St. John Paul II. I'd never heard this until the Synod, and I thought, boy, that's pretty brilliant. He said, affective collegiality precedes effective collegiality, which I thought was brilliant. So the affect to the friendship, and that has to precede, the effective, the kind of coming to consensus and things like that. So a good part of the Synod was this friendship building, which was, Timothy Radcliffe, who was the Dominican spiritual master who did our retreat, said, look, this is not going to make headlines like I made a friend with so-and-so, but it's really important. As you know, I mean,
this is absolutely the way people change, is that you meet people who have different points of view. You begin to view them not as demonic or completely different than you, but people who are different, but still people in their full humanity. And I would say to anyone who says that a headline saying transgender people can be godparents and be baptized, and, even if that was already happening, the fact that it was a pronouncement from the Vatican, it seems like once you start allowing that, then you're allowing for the full humanity of those people in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the community. And so if you view them as potential godparents, don't you view them as having spiritual gifts to potentially give the child?
Yeah, that they're people, and that they're part of the church, that they're Catholics. Another story that came out, very interesting, just yesterday, a long story which had been known. We reported this on Outreach, which is a website we run for LGBTQ Catholics, that Pope Francis meets regularly with transgender people at his weekly or monthly audiences. I think they meet monthly, and that's a big deal. And so his just sort of meeting these people is a real sign, as you say, of their dignity. Now, at the Synod, there was, quite a bit of pushback on that from different places, different bishops, different locales, different everybody, because in a lot of places, as you probably know, LGBTQ stuff is seen as an ideology. It's seen as colonialism. And, I had to listen to that. I mean, in other words, I wanted to listen to that and to hear like where they're coming from. And by the same token, I wanted to bring stories into the Synod of individuals, right? Like of people. So it was really pretty intense. Intense is a good word. I haven't used that. I kept saying exhausting, but I'll use the word intense. It was very intense. And for 4 weeks.
It can be both. Up next, more with Father Jim Martin. If you miss any part of today's program, you can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. And make sure you subscribe to the Next Generation podcast at stateofbelief.com/new podcast. That's stateofbelief.com/new podcast. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.
I'm Roxy Stone.
And I'm Caitlin Beatty.
Saved by the City is a podcast from two Christian women cracking the code of faith from the mean streets of New York City.
Our podcast captures what happens when purity culture meets hookup culture, when distraction steals from devotion, and when the diversity of viewpoints and lifestyles clash against assumptions.
Gotham can be a weird place for Christian women, but we're out there, and we have stories to tell.
Saved by the City, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
So this is a little fanboy, but what's Pope Francis like? As much as you can say. I mean, but I do see, you've met him not once now. Can I say you're besties? Is that okay?
I don't know if I'd say besties, but he, the nice thing is he does know me. So now when I go up to him, he's like, oh. So I met with him for about 45 minutes to an hour before the Synod began. And I can say we talked about LGBTQ things, among other things. I'll say he's just, I know this sounds banal, but He's very kind. He's a lot of fun. He's very funny. He's very jovial. And he's really on the ball too. I think that's one thing that people might not get, because a lot of times when you see him, he's presiding, or he looks very kind of downcast, or that's kind of his liturgy face, his mass face. In person, he is like, he knows exactly what's going on. Like
that's interesting.
Sometimes I think people think that he's just this kind of, well, keep it up. No, I mean, he really knows.
He's on it.
He's on it. He knows the people. He knows what he's done. He knows what he said. He knows exactly what's going on. And he was a really valued presence in the Synod. He would be there, I would say, most days, maybe every other day. And one of the things I thought was funny was when you would walk into this hall, it's called the aula. The aula, I guess, is Italian for hall. Huge place. We had 35 tables with 12 people apiece. Sometimes he would be there just at the head table. By the way, sitting around a round table like everybody else, not running the meeting. And he'd just be talking to people. People would come up and say hello. And I found it really charming, and he was, one of the things I like about him, I was saying this last night at Mass with some friends. He's always like focused on the person. It's not like, oh my gosh, I think if that were me and I'd have, endless 10 years of constantly meeting people, I'd be like, give me a break. He's always engaged and laughing and funny. I'll tell you a funny story that happened that gives you an insight, if you don't mind. This is kind of funny.
No, I'd love to hear it.
I think I can tell this. I don't think it's secret or anything. So one day, into the hall, towards the end, an elderly sister who was a delegate, came in with a huge black eye, huge shiner, and bandage, and she just looked terrible. And of course, everybody went up to her. And it turned out what happened was some random guy came up on the street and punched her in the face.
Wow.
She's like this 75, 80-year-old sister. And, it was just really unusual. So there's a big hall. And of course, there's a crowd around her. And you could see, it was interesting seeing almost physically the news make its way up to the head table as people were pointing And so the head of the Synod, Cardinal Grech, who's super nice, sees this, and someone comes up and he's listening, and he says to the Pope, you could see this happening, saying to the Pope, and the Pope looks and calls her up to the head table in front of everybody. This is sort of before everything starts. Gives her a huge, everybody claps. It was actually very moving. I mean, he's come up, gives her a huge hug. And then says something, and she bursts out laughing. She throws her head back laughing. And I said, you as a journalist too, I said to myself, oh, I want to find out.
You need to know what happened. You need to know what was said. Absolutely.
The next day she comes in. She's lovely and very, let me tell you, she's a lot more relaxed than I would be if I were punched in the face in Rome. So I said, sister, how are you doing? A lot better. I feel a lot better. I was a little, sort of traumatized, but now I feel a lot better. My eyes okay. And I said, can I ask you something? What did the Pope say to you? And now here's the thing, Paul, you would expect someone to say like, oh, I'm with you in prayer or whatever.
Yes.
And he said, if you want, I'll give you another one to even it out.
No. Oh my God. That is so funny.
Yeah. And she laughed. It
Yeah.
just made light of things. And I just thought that's great. It's just so human. He knew exactly what to say to make her laugh, and she loved it. And I just thought that was great.
Oh my God.
So that's who he is. He's just he's funny, he's relaxed, he's himself, he's playful. And he's with it. That's and he knew her. I mean, he also knew her too,
Yeah. Well, that's a fantastic story. One of the things that actually has been interesting to watch as an outsider has been how Pope Francis has engaged in American Catholicism. And, he has an opinion, which he's made clear through some of his actions. And, I don't know how much you can speak about it, but it's just interesting for him to be kind of observing this and, saying people who are claiming the mantle of Catholics, and I think they authentically are, claiming their faith in a way, but they're using it in such a way that feels to him like it's not following the way that the Catholic Church should be moving. I don't know if you can comment on that or if you've been watching it. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. And I mean, I think two things happened that were really notable. One is he came out and said, oftentimes he has these in-flight press conferences when he's going on a papal trip. And the Vatican journalists always laugh that the real news comes on the plane when he says all these things. And he was asked about, U.S. Catholics and some of the opposition in the U.S. Church, which is, I would say, small but vocal and pretty strong and pretty fierce. And he said, look, this is kind of a well-funded machine, and it's organized, and I don't agree with it. And he called out these kind of right-wing Catholics, and it was pretty dramatic for him to say that so bluntly. And then I think even more dramatically, the papal ambassador to the United States, called the nuncio, Cardinal Christophe Pierre, he was just made a cardinal, said at the U.S. Bishops' Conference meeting the same thing. Basically, there's a critique of some U.S. clergy and hierarchy who are opposing the Pope. And what does that mean? That doesn't mean just, I disagree with the Pope. It means some really sort of strong opposition. And recently, the Pope removed a bishop named Bishop Joseph Strickland of Tyler, Texas, who had said essentially, that the Pope was going against Catholicism, right? And so even the Pope has his limits. But he understands in the United States that there is this kind of very strong, very vocal opposition to him that is also often linked with kind of politics, unfortunately. Yeah. Right. So it's against being in favor of the refugee and the migrant, in favor of sort of combating climate change, in favor of really focusing on the poor. And some people, as we know politically, you don't have to be a Catholic to know this, some people don't like to hear that. And there are some people in the U.S. who don't like to hear some of those messages from Pope Francis.
Right. And yet, if you look at his encyclicals and all of that, like that's part of what he's been really focused on, as well as efforts towards peace.
Yeah. And, Laudato Si, probably his biggest encyclical on climate change. I always like to remind people that's an encyclical. That's a pretty high level of teaching. And to just say that's baloney and I'm not going to look at it. Okay, you might have problems with it. You might disagree with certain aspects, but to just throw it out or to say he has no authority, or some people say he's not really the Pope, and I can ignore him. It's pretty dramatic. And this has only happened under Francis. Under John Paul and Benedict, I don't think anyone would dare to say these kinds of things, right? And also Francis is really shaking things up. And he as you know, he likes to do that. Even the Synod, you would think people gathering together to talk about the future of the church together and looking at how the Holy Spirit is operating would be something everybody would welcome. No, it wasn't. And people are opposed to that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's the old saying is the Pope Catholic. I mean, they're actually bringing that up as not as a joke, but as a bludgeon and as an excuse to, and I will say, you've experienced kind of the wrath of this movement, and I just, I watch that, and I hope you feel my support. I don't know what else I could do, but I really,
I do.
There's so many of us out there who are watching it and saying, God, thank God for Father Martin, who's out there speaking about LGBTQ issues, also being in community with LGBTQ people, and giving, in some ways, offering that community a voice within the church. And recently you spoke at Georgetown, and there were just people who showed up to protest and offered horrible signs. And then, gratifyingly, there's others all of a sudden hear about it, and they go out there and are saying, actually, no, we, here at Georgetown, we actually welcome Father Martin. So, but this is something that you deal with all the time.
Yeah, pretty much every day. And, it's funny, Paul, because you've been with me, since the beginning of all this. It's kind of shocking. I'm used to it now, but I can see, like, if I disagree, we're on the same page about almost everything. I think if I ever disagree with something that Paul Raushenbush would say, I might write to you, or I might even on social media say, hey, I'm not sure about this, or what do you mean by this? I wouldn't say, you're going to hell, you're a heretic, you disgust me, and that's the part that I just am still surprised by.
Yeah.
But look, maybe we shouldn't be surprised, because look, even in the United States and even among intelligent people, there's still a lot of homophobia. And, that doesn't mean, and, that doesn't mean that everyone who disagrees with me is a homophobe, which is one of the critiques I often get. Oh, you think everyone who disagrees with you is a homophobe? No, not necessarily. But there is a lot of homophobia, and there are some homophobes out there, and it can be pretty ugly. I mean, the kinds of stuff that I get on social media, the kinds of things that I get sometimes in person, it's pretty ugly. And to get back to what you said earlier, a lot of it's just about ignorance and not knowing these people and just not understanding them. And, there's a term in theology, invincible ignorance. I mean, if you don't ever want to learn about it, then you're going to be stuck in that kind of hatred.
Oh my God, invincible ignorance. Please have that be your next book. That's like the perfect next book.
Can I tell you a funny story? So one of the things you will appreciate is what Jesus actually says to Lazarus is come out, right? So duro exo in the Greek is come out. That's the simplest translation. Duro exo. He casts out demon. The exo is exodus, is a road out, right? But I said to my publisher, given my LGBT work, if I call this book Come Out,
that is amazing.
Yeah,
that is
so
amazing. But you know what? That's actually great, because it's like leave behind all that shackles you, be who you are, and embrace life.
Yep. So I talk about the book in the book a little bit about what it means for the LGBTQ community, but that's what he actually says. Duro exo is come out. Come forth is a little more British, a little more, kind of formal, but that's what Jesus says to Lazarus. It's really powerful for LGBTQ people to hear that.
I love that. Thank you. Listen, I want to make sure that we turn to a little bit of the reason for the season. We're in Thanksgiving time, and there is so much terrible stuff going on in the world. I mean, I know you're weighed down by what's happening in the Middle East, as am I, and trying to hold on to some vision of peace. And then we have so much division, so much terrible stuff happening in our country as well. But, if it's possible, in the face of all of that, how do you understand the role of gratitude in the spiritual life?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's essential. It's hard to do when you're, I think of someone in Gaza right now or anywhere in the Middle East, to tell someone to be grateful. But in my own life, even in difficult times, it's essential to kind of look for the signs of God's presence. Let's put it that way. Where is God active? Where are there kind of sparks of hope? Where are there places where there is light, right? And so I think without gratitude, you end up focusing only on the negative. You end up focusing only on places where your life is lacking, and you tend to compare yourself with other people's lives. We have an expression in the Jesuits, compare and despair. And gratitude, I think, grounds us first in, where God is, and helps us to really move on with life. Because if you're only focusing on the negative, you can't move on. I mean, I think St. Ignatius said, ingratitude is the worst of all sins, because it really denies where God is. I'll tell you a story. A couple of years ago, there was I don't even remember what it was. Something bad was happening in my life. And I said to my spiritual director said, are you being honest with God in prayer? And I said, I always am honest with God. I'm complaining about this. I'm complaining about that. And he said, but are you looking at the good stuff too? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, I thought this was really interesting. He said, you're actually not being honest with God if you're only focusing on the negative stuff. Honesty would be looking at the whole picture. I thought I've never forgotten that you can be upset about whatever, illness, war, I mean, all sorts of things. But, to look at also where God is, I think is really important, to be honest with God in that way. So it's gratitude's essential. It's just essential.
Yeah. I wrote a piece a while ago called like how to give thanks when there's nothing to be thankful for. And like, part of the litany of this, I give thanks for this, I give thanks for this, I give thanks for this. And when those things are taken away, when health is taken away, when your loved ones are taken away, and in some ways, like gratitude is, what I resolved at is gratitude is just insisting that there's a yes to life.
Yeah, I mean, there's always something. Do you have one friend? Do you have one family member that you're grateful for?
And you're alive. You're still alive. Just the fact of your existence, and allowing for the fact that while you're still alive, finding that as honestly as its own reason for gratitude. And
and I think it enables you to go on. Like, I mean, I'm thinking in the midst of all this difficulty now, it enables you to continue to work for peace, to continue to build on friendships, to continue to hope, right? Yeah. And so it's essential. It's essential.
Yeah. Do you have a place that you go for Thanksgiving, or do you sit around with your brothers in the Jesuits? What do you like to do for Thanksgiving?
Well, it's funny you should ask. I usually go home to my family in Philadelphia, but everybody has COVID.
Oh wow!
So I'm not sure what's going to happen. I'm actually just this morning I was trying to figure out where I'm going to go. So I might stay home with my Jesuit brothers. I might go home to a very small dinner, but not a big Thanksgiving this year on the Martin family. So.
Okay, I'm sorry to hear that. Well, before I let you go, I do want to say what's been interesting in my life over the last 4 months is all of the people I meet who have met you in various ways. And I'm specifically thinking of 2 actors who I met separately who were in a play about Judas Iscariot.
The last days of Judas Iscariot. Yep.
Yeah. And 2 different actors I met in 2 different places who both were just like, Father Jim Martin was such an important presence on that set, and they've never forgotten it. So I am curious, because you have this, you have an ability to engage not just in kind of traditional spirituality, but also recognizing the power of other avenues for people to find meaning, find value, and find spirit.
Yeah, I mean, that was a lot of fun. I actually wrote a book about it called A Jesuit Off Broadway.
Right, which is amazing.
Thanks. And I think, part of it is, I mean, you know me, Paul, and I think you're very much the same way. Like, we didn't grow up, you weren't Reverend Paul Raushenbush when you came out of the womb, right? And I wasn't Father Jim Martin when I came out of the womb. So we both had lives, and we both know how to deal with people who are not and encounter people who are not in religious settings. I mean, I'm actually... I came to religion kind of late in my life. And so, I worked for GE, I knew people. And so it's easy for me to kind of, interact with people from all different walks of life. I have to say, I found the theater community fascinating. I mean, I knew zero about the theater community. I talk about that in the book. And I'll tell you a funny story. I knew so little that I would say things like, it's a play by Stephen Adly Guirgis, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning playwright, called The Last Days of Judas Iscariot, that was put on. The director was Philip Seymour Hoffman, who has sadly left us. And all sorts of people were in it. Sam Rockwell, Eric Bogosian, all sorts of people, fun people. Anyway, long story short, I knew very little about theater. Like, I was in one play in high school. So I'd say things like, when are the practices? And they'd be like, oh, you mean rehearsals? And I'd say, when does it start? And they're like, you mean opening night? So what I try to do is to help them understand the story of Judas. It was about Judas's betrayal, and I found it so I learned about them, and they learned about me, and we're still friends. And I was made a member of this Labyrinth theater company eventually, and it was fascinating to me.
Yeah. But I do think, for me, the theater, music, pop music, and film are there, just like these kinds of expressions. I was always very, very interested in how they share spiritual messages, and kind of in surprising ways. Like, David Bowie for me was such a main figure, and then he has this song called "Somebody Up There Likes Me," and I was always just like, why do I love this song so much? And it was like, it's because it was my way of connecting with a spiritual idea when it wasn't at all connected with the church.
Well, and also, by the way, his last song was about Lazarus. It was a Lazarus theme song. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
It's
full circle.
Yeah. It's quite a strong story. It's funny. I'll say one thing that I like about being with people who are not in the religion world, like in theater or the arts. I think one of the things that I find refreshing for me is that they know that I have no ulterior motive. Like, I don't want to be in their play. I don't want to take over. I don't want to, write a play or act in it. So I think they're relaxed around me, and I'm relaxed around them. Same with, people in other walks of life. And I think they can kind of be themselves with me because they know there's no competition, and there's no, I'm not going to be like, if I met some sports star, I met a couple people, and they know that I'm not angling for a job or anything.
But what you don't know is that they're the up and coming Jesuit who's going to knock you off your pedestal, Reverend Martin.
That's right. Be afraid.
Brother Jim, thank you so much for being on The State of Belief and being such a great friend and such a great presence in the world. Congratulations on your book, Come Forth. And happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me on the show. Always a delight. Thanks for your friendship and your support for all these, 20 years. It obviously started when we were both 10 years old. But I'm really grateful. And happy Thanksgiving to you and your whole family.
Thank you. I want to take a moment to say to you, all of the State of Belief listeners, how grateful I am for you and for your participation in this project. I also am feeling a lot of gratitude towards all of the partners that Interfaith Alliance and all of our affiliates work with. I have been around the country so much in this past year and have seen remarkable people standing up, speaking up for a sense of equality, a sense of freedom, a sense of love, of justice, and speaking out for our democracy, which right now is at such risk. I also want to say a personal word. My father died at the age of 95 just last week. And I just want to say I'm so grateful for his life, for all that he was able to see, accomplish, and be, and for the family, and for the wonderful life he gave myself and my 3 siblings. And I just, it's always sad when a family member passes, but this was not particularly sad in the sense of the fullness of it. And I'm just so grateful that we were able to be with him all the way through it, and I'm grateful for his life. And so I definitely want to say that. And I just want to send my fondest wishes to all of you, and my prayer that all of you will find something to feel grateful for in this time. And I recognized what a heavy and difficult time this is for our entire world. And I just want to give thanks for all of those who are trying to continue to forge relationships that will lead to peace, forge relationships that will lead to communities feeling tighter and responsible to one another. I'm just grateful for all of those who can help, who are looking for ways to help in this difficult time. So thank you to all of you, and I hope you have a very happy Thanksgiving. And that's all the time we have for The State of Belief this week. Be sure to subscribe to the new and improved podcast called The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/new podcast. Subscribe to The State of Belief today. We need your help keeping The State of Belief going. I hope you'll consider being a partner in this crucial work by making a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And if you're getting something out of this show, which I assume you are, share it with your friends and family. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going when the show is over. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at State of Belief and share State of Belief with the people in your networks. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on the State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.